What's up everyone, Colt Capperrune here. Thank you so much for stopping by for yet another video on the channel. Appreciate you being here. So working in a commercial studio, in a big studio, can be a little intimidating, especially if you've never done it before, and especially if there's a big console in the studio. So I have a drum session this evening in a studio that I've never worked in before. I have physically been in the studio, but I've never actually worked it. And I figured it'd be a good opportunity to kind of take you guys along to the session and just kind of go over some things that I do when I'm working in a studio that I've never worked in before. And hopefully that will help some of you as you're working through the ranks when you get the opportunity to work in a commercial space for the first time. Or if you do already do that, hopefully you'll pick up on some of these tips and tricks and workflow things. And hopefully this will help someone. So a couple things I want to go over real quick that should help everyone watching this, regardless of your position and what it is that you do. First thing is signal flow. Understanding general concepts of signal flow is very important. So the basic idea is the sound always starts at the microphone and it always has to end at the computer. And what actual path does it have to take to get from the microphone to the computer? Every piece of gear has an input and an output. And so you're going to go from the microphone, out of the microphone, into the microphone preamp. Maybe it's on a console, maybe it's a standalone preamp. Then you're going to come out of that preamp. Maybe you're going to go into a compressor. You're going to come out of that compressor, and then you're going to go into the interface that feeds the computer. You really just look at the actual path, microphone into preamp, out of preamp, etc., etc., etc. Really helps be able to be efficient with your setup and not get connections wrong, and it really helps. So most commercial studios that you're ever going to work in are going to have a patch bay. Most common things about patch bays is the input and the output of every piece of gear and every channel on the console, if there's a console, is generally run through a patch bay. Most patch bays in most studios that I've worked in are outs over ins. And so what that means is the top row of a particular patch bay is all the outputs of a piece of gear, and the bottom row is all the inputs of a piece of gear. So you have all your mic lines in a room, and there's a panel on the wall, usually. Those mic lines on the panel in the live room or the tracking room are tied into the patch bay. And on the patch bay, you'll have access points to tie into each one of those. And then also all your mic preamps will be on there. And so you would patch from the wall panel to the input of the mic preamp, and then output of the mic preamp to either your interface that's going into Pro Tools, or maybe you're going into a compressor or whatever, and then you're going to patch the output of that into your interface. Now a patch bay, if there's a big console in the room, it's very common that every channel on the console also has its own access point in the patch bay, in addition to all the pieces of outboard gear and the mic lines and the interfaces. Okay, I want this microphone, maybe you're going to use the preamp in the console, so I want this microphone to hit channel 5 on the console, so we're going to go patch bay input 5 on the console, and then a lot of consoles, especially in these rooms, will have direct outputs on each channel. This is the most common way to do it, and then so you're going to run output of channel 5 on the console into your interface, and so that is the basic breakdown of patch bays and how they work. The next most intimidating thing in a big commercial space to a lot of people is the console. If you've never worked on a big SSL or a big Neve, I think there's a really old Soundcraft in the studio that we're working tonight that's been heavily modified. So that should be interesting. But all consoles work the same way. The general concept of a large format console is you have multiple inputs for each channel, and then each channel has an input gain or a mic preamp depending on the console, and then there's a bunch of Q sends for your headphone mixes or for effects sends or whatever. It gets a little complicated, and then after that you have your EQ, and then after that you have your fader, and that is the general concept. And most recording consoles have an input and a direct output on the same channel, and so most of the time what you're going to find yourself doing is run microphones into a channel, and then you're going to send to whatever headphones that you want, EQ however you want, fader for level, hitting Pro Tools that you want, or monitor volume directly back out of that channel into the interface that's hitting Pro Tools or whatever DAW that you're using. The recording console is just a grid. It's just that same thing on every channel. Some studios will run their headphone mixes in the live room based on the actual cue mixes on the console, so you have physical knobs to turn for every individual person's headphone mix. And some studios run sends out of Pro Tools to each different headphone mix, and then you would adjust them in Pro Tools on the computer. Some studios, like if you work at a studio like Blackbird here in town, they actually run outs for everything, and then you get your own mini console, your own mini mixer for your headphones. And so you get to personally, if you're the person recording, you get to personally adjust your levels for everything independently. So those are the typical ways that all monitoring systems work in commercial studios. So one of the things that I try to do in every session that I work in a studio that I've not ever worked in before is I try to get a gear list. And so I know what it is we're going to the studio for. Today we're going to track drums tonight in this studio. And then I look through the entire list of microphones and preamps and compressors, and I get a general idea of what all they have. From that, I have a real good idea in my head already before I even get there of what pieces of gear I'm going to use for what. So then if you are unfamiliar with some of those pieces of gear, it then gives you the opportunity to do your research. You can just jump on YouTube right here and kind of wrap your head around the different options that are available to you in this particular room you're getting ready to work in. There's going to be a couple microphones and a couple pieces of gear that I've never used before because it's in a new room that I've never worked before. I'm going in with a game plan, and I'm going to, in my mind, be paying attention to the things that could be improved upon and the things that are really great, that worked out really great. And so this running tab in my mind eventually helps me learn session after session after session after session, and it just improves the quality every session over time. So I think that about does it. We're going to Gnome Studios here in Nashville, right downtown. You ready? Let's go. So we picked a couple spots out in the room. We're gonna try right here, kick, snare, hat, and then we're gonna play a beat, and then we're gonna move it right here because this spot also sounds really good. We're definitely setting up in the first spot because that's way, way better. So the location of the kit has been picked, and now he's just gonna set up his whole kit, and then we'll get mics up. All right. Sorry this lighting's a little weird. I got a light on the camera because it's so dim in here. Drums are all set up, and I'm gonna walk you through what we have, and then I'll take you in and let you hear some of the drums. Okay, so inside the kick drum, obviously you can't see. Oh, maybe you can, it's way in there. We got a vintage D12. On the outside kick, we have a Audio-Technica 4033. We have a homemade sub kick. It sounds really good. It actually sounds a little bit better than a Yamaha sub kick in my opinion. I actually brought this. On the snare drum, we have a Beyerdynamic M201. Really like the M201. On the snare bottom, we have a vintage Beta 57. For those of you that have never seen a vintage one before, they're kind of neat. On tom 1, we have a lovely little 421. This is the reissue, a new one. Tom 2, we have a Beta 52. Then we've got a matched pair of 414s on overheads. On hi-hat and ride, we have some vintage 451 EBs. I've never used this particular version of these microphones before, but they sound pretty good. The glorious Coles 4038s on room mics. So we've got one here and then one over here. They are both equidistant from the snare drum. And so we actually measured them out. Both of them are the exact same distance from the snare drum. Same with the overheads, I'm big on that. So that is the drum setup. So let me take you in the control room and show you what preamps we're using for what microphones, and then we'll take a listen to a sound clip of what the drums sound like. Okay, I haven't eaten like all day. And they have Coke and chips here, come on. So snack time while we discuss what preamps we're using. So Rob here actually works at Vintage King, and so they were kind enough to let us, give us or borrow us? Borrow. I'm taking them home. To let us borrow some preamps, and so that way we had some more choices for this drum set. I guess this wouldn't be a video unless I cracked open a beverage. Look at the coasters. Come on. How cool is that? Not that I'm advocating for Antelope, I'm just saying. Console tape and a Sharpie. So we're gonna mark off every preamp and what microphones are hooked into it. So for the kick-in mic, we are using a Cappy VP28. Those of you that have watched the channel, you've seen lots of Cappy stuff. For kick out, we're using one of these Day King mic pre and equalizer. This channel strip, I really like these. These sound great. So we're using that on the kick out. Another one on the sub kick. And then we are using another Cappy VP28 on snare top and a Cappy VP312 on snare bottom. Another Day King channel strip for Tom 1 and for Tom 2. We're using a pair of these A-Design mic pre's for the overheads. And we're using another pair of Cappy VP28s for hat and ride. Dawn Audio, like the person Dawn? Yep. These are Dawn Audio 1073 kits. So this is what we're using on the room mics, on the Coles ribbons. They sound really good. And then the ribbons are going from there into a pair of these Rupert Neve Design 535 diode bridge compressors. These are a little bit slower and gooier and mushier than I thought they would be, but they sound really good. And so I've got them, the parallel turned down just a little bit. So we're at like 75% on the compression, and I'm smacking them with like 18 dB of gain reduction, and it sounds really good. From all that, we're going straight into these Focusrite converters, and then straight into Pro Tools. So the sub kick in there, you built it, right?
I did. Yeah, so I'm just using an old Mackie 824 monitor speaker.
As opposed to an NS10 speaker.
As opposed to an NS10
Which
speaker.
is probably thicker sounding than an NS10.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is why it sounds better than a Yamaha sub
a little
kick.
bit sturdier speaker.
Okay.
I had an old, it was like a kid's drum set, drum shell, and I took it apart, used 2 lugs to hold the speaker in place.
Nice.
And just put it inside that drum shell.
DIY king in the house.
Oh yeah.
Well, it sounds awesome.
Thanks, dude.
So here's what the raw drums sound like. Okay, so headphone sends in this particular studio is all done via Pro Tools. You can see that there are actually sends on each of the channels. And so each of those sends in Pro Tools feeds one of these Behringer PowerPlay 16. And then so the drummer or whoever is recording here has one of those in the room with them where they can adjust their own individual levels on everything. In this particular studio, they're not running sends off of the console, they're running sends out of Pro Tools. It's a 50-50 shot whether you're gonna run your headphone sends from the console or from Pro Tools. That's it. Drums is done.
We did it.
We got through the session, even though I've never worked here before. So we'll go back to my place and we will talk about some more stuff. And I'm back. Y'all didn't think you were gonna get through a whole video without some fine espresso, did you? So it's kind of hard to be a professional producer, engineer, and maintain some professionalism while I'm filming for YouTube. I want to go over a few things that kind of slipped through the cracks while I was in the studio. First of all, yes, I was wearing 2 different shirts in that footage and a third one now because this was filmed over 3 days actually. So no, I didn't actually do a wardrobe change in the middle of my session. Next, I want to say thanks to Raviner for letting me film while I was producing them. It takes some more time for me to do this film thing while I'm actually producing. And there's a bunch of videos in the pipe that are coming up, so stay tuned, that are going to be me working with clients in the studio and showing my productions and my mixes and how I engineer. And I really appreciate my clients when they're cool and let me do this. So whenever I do, I'm going to give them a shout out and drop either their website or their social media in the bio of the video. As thanks to them, if you could go check them out, it would mean the world to them, so that way I can keep doing videos like this. And while you're down there, you can check out my Instagram page and my website, links to all of it in the bio. And while we're on this, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for sticking around this long. I appreciate it. And I know a lot of you guys aren't subscribers yet that are watching this, so if you wouldn't mind, hit the subscribe and hit the bell icon next to the subscribe. Give me a thumbs up, drop me a comment, let me know what you think. If you have something to add to this, I would love to hear from you. So even though having your first session in a big commercial studio can be somewhat intimidating, it's like ripping the Band-Aid off. Like once you do it, it's much, much easier and it's much less intimidating. So this is very much a situation where if you've not yet had a session in a commercial studio and you get the opportunity to, just go for it. And after your first time, it will be much easier. And then after your fifth time, it won't really be any big deal. Every studio is different. I've worked in studios that are very small commercial studios all the way up to like the biggest, most ridiculous studios here in Nashville, and they all present their own sets of challenges, and it's all unique. Once you just get in and do it, it'll be much easier. So I hope that this video helped you prepare for your first commercial studio session, or if you're already doing them, hopefully you picked up a few extra things in this video. So one of the things that I neglected to put in was how I picked the spots to set up the drum kit. So what I did is I walked around, and I literally just walked around the room clapping my hands, and what I was listening for is wherever the room sounded the most even to me, where it had no slap back. The ceiling in that particular studio didn't have 100% absorption, and so I was being very conscious of making sure there was not going to be any slap coming off the snare drum, listening to the decay of the room and how even the room sounded, and even left to right, if this side had way more reverb or echo than this side, I wanted it to be nice and even sounding. So I walked around clapping and then picked a couple spots for which to set the drums up and try, and that's how I picked those spots. So the one thing that we did try that we ended up changing, and it didn't make it on any footage, was we tried a Sennheiser 441 on the snare drum. I've had mixed success with those. Of the options that they had at that studio, it's what I thought was going to be the best. So we tried it. It was okay. It was fine. Luckily, I brought my own Dynamic M201, which I like a lot. It's just like a really big, really open sounding 57. It's what a 57 should sound like, in my opinion. Cue the hate in the comments. Back to it. And so a 441 just didn't really work on that snare drum in that room on that drum kit, so we swapped it out for my Dynamic that I brought with me. Also, the patch bay in this studio was outputs over inputs, outs over ins, and so it was exactly what I talked about earlier. I meant to say that in the session, but I'm busy producing. As long as you approach the patch bay situation with the mindset that I went over earlier in this video, you should have a pretty easy time getting through it and making connections. Yes, it's a little complicated, but when you really break it down, like microphone to Pro Tools and what connections need to be made along the way, it's much easier. So another thing I had to be very careful of is using two different microphones on the toms. They did have two 421s that I could have used 421s on both toms. That was probably the best option that they had that were matching for both toms in that particular studio. But I don't really love 421s on the low toms. They're not quite thick enough for me for the sounds that I usually go after. And so we decided to go with a kick mic on the floor tom and a 421 on the rack tom. It worked out great, but I just want to mention that had they sound mismatched or different, too far apart from each other, I would not have done that. And so that's something that I was very careful to pay attention to when setting the drums up. I briefly mentioned this, but I want to touch on it a little bit more. One of the things that I do in every single drum session is I actually take a tape measure and I measure the overheads from the snare drum, but more specifically, not just from the snare drum, from the actual contact patch on the snare drum, like where the drummer hits, because every drummer hits a snare drum in a little bit different spot. And so I've recorded drummers where if out of your snare drum, some drummers hit right here, and some drummers hit right in the center, and some drummers hit over here. And so they're usually pretty consistent, and you can see a little wear patch if the heads aren't brand new, which I always suggest them put on heads and have like a rehearsal or an hour of playing time before they get in the studio. So I measure from the contact patch where they're actually hitting the snare to both overheads, and they need to be the exact same distance from the snare drum, so that way the snare is perfectly in phase to both overheads. mics. Same with the room microphones. We go from the contact patch on the snare drum to the room microphones. So I'm less worried about snare and kick in overheads because usually I'm high passing overheads a little bit, and so there's less low end in the overheads than there is in the room mics for my personal style. But for room mics, if I can get the room mics also the same distance from the snare and from the kick, I do that. Some rooms aren't big enough. Sometimes how the drum set's set up to where the kit sounds the best in the room, you don't have that option. But if I can, we tried and it just didn't work in that particular studio, so we just went from the snare drum equidistant to the room mics. But if I can, I will do snare and kick both equidistant to the room mics. So that does it for me today. Thank you guys so much for watching again. I really, really appreciate it. I appreciate all the support. I appreciate all the thumbs up and all the comments and all the subscribes. Seriously awesome. I can't believe that the channel is growing the way that it is, and it's honest to God, thanks to you guys. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Make sure you check out my Instagram at Colt Capperrune. Hit up my website, coltcapperrune.com, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.